It was a cold winter night. Snowflakes danced in the wind, blanketing the world in a soft, eerie silence. But beneath the tranquility, something sinister lurked in the shadows. Tonight, we bring you true winter horror stories that'll make you think twice before stepping out into the snow again. The frozen highway encounter. It was a bone-chilling night, the kind where the cold seems to seep into your very bones. Snowflakes, like tiny shards of ice, whipped around in the wind, creating an eerie blur of white in the darkness. On this night, the world seemed frozen in time. The roads were deserted. The only sounds a crunch of tires on snow and the occasional gust of wind rattling the trees along the highway. A lone driver, a man in his early 30s, had just left a small town in the northern wilderness. His car was the only one on a long stretch of road, isolated by miles of thick forest. The headlights cut through the dark, casting long shadows in every direction. It had been hours since he'd seen another soul on the road, but there was something more unsettling than just the silence. The temperature had been dropping steadily since he left, and his breath fogged up the windshield. He had the heater on full blast, but it barely made a dent in the cold that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to keep his mind focused. He'd been on roads like this before, remote, desolate, and dangerously cold. But tonight felt different. Suddenly, in the distance, he saw something. A figure. A person standing alone on the side of the road. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and then looked again. The figure didn't move. Not even when his headlights hit it directly. It was too far to make out clearly, but the way it stood there, so still, sent a chill down his spine. He slowed the car down instinctively. Was it someone in trouble? Maybe a hitchhiker? Or worse, someone stranded after a crash? As the car rolled to a stop, the figure remained motionless. The driver hesitated. He rolled down the window slightly, the frigid air biting at his skin as he called out, "Hey, you need help?" No response. The driver frowned. The figure didn't even flinch. He called out again, louder this time, but the person remained silent, unmoving. Something wasn't right. The stillness of the scene felt unnatural, as though the air itself held its breath. He glanced nervously at the rearview mirror, but the road behind him was still empty, just darkness and snow. He had to go. This wasn't right. With his heart racing, the driver hit the gas, speeding away from the eerie figure. But as he passed it, he stole one last glance through the side mirror. The figure was still standing there, watching him, but now its head slowly turned toward him. For a moment, everything went still. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the figure's eyes locked onto his. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it looked at him. Hollow, empty, almost as if there was nothing but darkness behind those eyes. The driver's breath caught in his throat, but he kept his foot pressed firmly on the gas. The figure's gaze lingered for just a moment longer before the man lost sight of it. His hands were clammy on the wheel as he sped down the road, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't until hours later, when he stopped at a diner in a nearby town, that he heard the story. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, casually mentioned how a man had crashed his car on that very stretch of road years ago. His body was never found, though the car was discovered abandoned in the snow, its windows shattered as if something or someone had torn through it. The driver went cold. The waitress went on, oblivious of the horror settling into the man's bones. She said that some of the locals had taken to calling that stretch of road the frozen highway. It wasn't the snow or the ice that made it so chilling, though. It was a figure. The one that some drivers said they saw standing by the side of the road, never moving, never speaking. It was always there, waiting, watching, and sometimes, just sometimes, it followed. The driver left the diner in a daze, his mind racing as he tried to shake the cold sweat that had settled on his skin. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure on the road, the hollow, empty eyes that stared right through him, and the feeling that he had narrowly escaped something far worse than a cold winter's night. But as he drove further, the thought lingered, gnawing at him. Could it have been a hallucination? Could he have imagined it? After all, it was freezing cold, the kind of cold that messes with your head, warping reality. Or was it something more? His mind began to replay every detail of that night. The figure, the stillness, the way it had turned its head slowly, unnervingly, as if it knew he was watching. Something told him it wasn't just a random hitchhiker or a lost soul. This felt different. This felt like a warning. As he continued down the highway, the night seemed to grow colder. The snowstorm from earlier had worsened, and the wind howled louder, whipping the snow into blinding sheets. The road was narrowing, the trees closing in on either side. He looked around nervously, but all he could see was the endless white of the snowstorm. The world reduced to shades of gray and white. Then suddenly something caught his eye. In the distance, through the swirling snow, he saw it again. The figure. It was standing by the road, just as it had before, unmoving in the blizzard. But this time it wasn't far off. This time it was much closer. So close. He could almost make out the shape of its tattered coat, the pale hands hanging at its sides. His pulse quickened, and his heart began to race as he instinctively slowed down. Was it the same figure? Could it really be the same person from earlier? No, it couldn't be. But the feeling in his gut told him otherwise. As his headlights illuminated the figure, he could see that it was the same, exactly the same lifeless posture, the same hollow eyes. But there was one difference this time. As the car approached, the figure moved. Slowly at first, just a shift in its position. But then it took one deliberate step forward, and then another, and another. The driver's hands were shaking on the wheel now, his breath shallow. He had to do something. In a panic, he slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The car shot forward, the tires screeching on the snow-covered road. But as he sped past the figure, he dared to look at it one last time. It was no longer standing still. It was following him. The figure, moving unnaturally fast, was walking toward the car, its feet seemingly gliding over the snow, leaving no footprints behind. It was closing the distance, and the driver's panic surged to a new level. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked back at the road, focusing on nothing but getting away. He couldn't outrun it. The road ahead seemed endless, the snow and wind closing around him. But no matter how fast he drove, the figure kept pace. It was always there, just behind him, walking in the same eerie, deliberate steps, its hollow eyes fixed on him with a terrifying intensity. After what felt like an eternity, the driver finally spotted the dim lights of a distant gas station. He pushed the car harder, his tires screeching against the icy pavement as he veered off the road and into the parking lot, slamming on the brakes. His hands trembled as he sat in the car, gasping for air, heart racing. For a moment, he thought he was safe. But when he dared to glance out the window, the figure was still there, standing just beyond the lights of the gas station, watching, waiting, and then, with one final horrific motion, it vanished into the blizzard. The driver sat frozen in the car, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as he stared at the spot where the figure had stood moments before. The snowstorm raged around him, the wind howling as though it too was trying to warn him. But there was no movement now, no sign of the figure, just the cold, relentless storm. For a long while, he didn't move. He couldn't. His entire body trembled with adrenaline and fear. Every part of him screamed at him to leave, to drive away as fast as possible, but he couldn't shake the feeling that if he did, the figure would follow him again. He'd never be able to escape it. Finally, he forced himself to step out of the car. His boots crunched in the snow as he approached the gas station's door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The moment his fingers made contact, the door swung open with an unsettling creak, as though the building itself was alive, waiting for him to enter. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above, casting an eerie glow over the small, otherwise empty station. The clerk behind the counter looked up briefly, then went back to cleaning a glass. She didn't seem to notice the fear in his eyes or the panic that radiated off of him. She was used to travelers, especially in this remote part of the world. But to him, the place felt off, unnaturally still. He approached the counter, his voice barely a whisper. I saw something outside," he stammered, glancing back toward the window. A figure. It was following me. The clerk glanced up, her expression distant. She didn't seem surprised or even particularly concerned. She simply nodded, as if she had heard this story countless times before. "You're not the first to see it," she said flatly, her voice tinged with something colder than the snowstorm outside. The man blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "What do you mean? What do you mean, I'm not the first?" She paused for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to speak. Then, with a slow, deliberate tone, she spoke again. "Years ago, there was a crash right on that stretch of road. The driver, a young man, went off the road in the snow, and they found his car, just like you did. But he was never found. No body, no blood, nothing." The man swallowed hard, the cold sweat on his neck growing colder. "What happened to him? Where did he go?" The clerk sighed, her eyes darkening as she glanced toward the window. "They say he's still out there," she murmured. "They say he wanders the highway now, looking for someone to take his place." "Take his place?" the man repeated, his heart sinking. "What does that mean?" She looked at him then, her gaze sharp, as if she could see right through him. "You saw him, didn't you? The figure, standing by the side of the road. He watches, waits for someone who's lost, someone who's alone." The man's throat tightened. He had seen it. He knew it, but he couldn't understand it. The clerk continued, her voice now a chilling whisper. "They say when he chooses someone, they can never escape him. He'll follow you, always. And when he catches up, well, no one ever sees that person again." The room seemed to close in around him. He could feel the weight of her words pressing on him, the air thick with the unspoken truth. But he had to know. He had to ask. What happens when he catches them? What does he do? The clerk didn't respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes unreadable. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to say it aloud. "He takes you. You disappear, just like him, forever." A cold chill ran down his spine. He turned, his mind spinning, trying to process what he had just heard. But before he could make sense of it, he heard a sound from outside, a soft, distant crunching noise in the snow. He stiffened, his eyes darting to window. There, standing in the same place where the figure had been moments before, was the silhouette. It was him. He knew it without a doubt. The same lifeless, haunting figure, watching him, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The clerk, seeing his panic, gave him one last chilling warning. You can't run from him. It's too late. He's already chosen. The man stood frozen, his heart racing in his chest. He could feel the clerk's eyes boring into him, but his focus was entirely on the figure outside. The darkness seemed to swallow the world around it, but the figure remained unblinking, unmoving, its gaze locked on him as if it could see straight through the walls of the gas station. For a moment, he couldn't move. The weight of her words echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. He's already chosen. The wind howled outside, a violent gust slamming against the station's windows, rattling the glass like a warning. He didn't know how much time had passed, but it felt like an eternity, the air thick with dread. The figure outside took a step forward. The man's pulse quickened. He could feel his legs shaking beneath him. He wasn't sure if it was fear or the cold creeping into his bones, but it didn't matter. The figure was moving closer, each step purposeful, deliberate, the same hollow eyes never once leaving him. In a desperate, frantic motion, the man turned away from the window and dashed toward the door. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't face whatever that thing was. His instinct screamed at him to run, to escape. But as his hand gripped the door handle, it froze. The door wouldn't budge. It was locked. He glanced back at the clerk, panic flooding his chest. She was still standing behind the counter, her expression unreadable. It was as if she hadn't even moved during the entire exchange. She hadn't even acknowledged the figure outside. "Let me out!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the door. But the clerk only shook her head slowly. "You can't leave. Not now. He's already here." His heart pounded in his ears. He tried the handle again, desperate, but it was no use. The figure was now at the gas station's parking lot. Step after slow, deliberate step, it glided through the snow, its feet making no sound as it approached. The man felt his breath catch in his throat, a freezing grip tightening around his chest. His mind raced, but no thoughts came, only pure, raw terror. Then the figure stopped. It stood just a few feet away from the window. He could feel its presence, the overwhelming weight of it pressing against the glass. He could see the outline of its face now, but there were no features, no mouth, no nose, no detail. Just hollow, endless darkness where its eyes should have been. A void. His body trembled as he backed away from the window, his mind screaming for him to move. But it was too late. Suddenly, the door of the gas station flew open, the force of it slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. The cold air poured in, followed by the eerie silence of the snowstorm. The figure, still standing outside, didn't move. It didn't need to. A voice, cold and distant, echoed through the stillness. It came from the figure, but it didn't sound like any voice the man had ever heard before. "You shouldn't have stayed," the voice whispered. He turned around in panic, eyes darting around the gas station, but no one else was there, just him and the clerk, and the figure outside. The clerk's voice broke the silence again, quieter now, almost sad. "He doesn't let you leave once you've seen him. Once he knows you, he owns you." The man's eyes widened as he felt a cold hand settle on his shoulder, a touch so icy that it pierced through his jacket like needles. His breath hitched in his throat as he spun around, but there was no one there. But something was there. The figure was now inside the gas station. No footsteps, no sound. It was just there, standing at the edge of the room, its eyes, those black, hollow eyes, fixed directly on him. A wave of dread washed over him, suffocating him, as though the very air had thickened, choking him. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But the clerk only nodded, as if she had seen this play out countless times before. "It's too late," she said, almost pityingly. "He always takes what he wants." The figure stepped forward, slowly. The temperature dropped even further, as if the very presence of it was freezing the room. And then, just as it was about to reach him, the lights flickered and the power cut out entirely. The gas station was plunged into darkness. The only sound left was the frantic beating of his heart in his chest. In that pitch-black silence, the figure moved closer. He could feel it now, its cold breath against his neck, its presence overwhelming. And then a scream, his scream, echoing into the void. The scream echoed in the dark, swallowed by the blizzard outside. It wasn't just a scream of fear. It was a cry of pure terror, as if he knew there was no escape, no way out. The temperature dropped even further, his breath turning into visible clouds in front of him. The darkness around him felt alive, as if the very walls of the gas station were closing in. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The fear had paralyzed him. His legs felt like lead. Then the figure stepped forward, its cold presence filling the space, closing the distance between them. The hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and for a moment the man thought he saw something, or rather, someone in those eyes. It was himself, his own reflection, but twisted, haunted, a version of himself that had been trapped in the snowstorm for eternity. The figure had taken him long ago. The man's heart slammed against his ribs as he tried to back away, but the figure reached out, its fingers like ice brushing against his arm. The touch sent a jolt of frozen energy coursing through him, making every muscle lock in place. He couldn't move. The clerk's voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just her. It was as though the entire gas station itself was speaking. "He's been waiting for you," the voice said, its tone filled with inevitability. "He takes those who wander too long in the snow. Those who have seen him, they never leave." The figure didn't say a word. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The man's vision blurred as the coldness spread, creeping into his very soul. He could feel the ice freezing his thoughts, his memories, his very essence. He knew what was happening now. The figure wasn't just a ghost or a phantom. It was something far older, something tied to the land, to the snow, to the lost souls that had wandered too far, too long. And now he was one of them. In a final, desperate attempt, he tried to scream again, but the sound was lost, swallowed by the cold and the darkness. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The world around him began to fade, the light from the storm outside dimming as the snowstorm blurred everything. The figure reached out once more, and this time the man didn't resist. There was no need. His body had already surrendered to the cold. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the snowstorm, the gas station was quiet. Too quiet. The clerk was gone, and the tracks in the snow outside led to nowhere. The only sign of life was the abandoned car, sitting in the parking lot, its engine cold. The lights of the station flickered on for a moment before shutting off completely. Locals passing by would see the old gas station, nestled in the middle of nowhere, just as it always had been. They'd drive by, unaware of what had really happened that night. They wouldn't see the figure, standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. And the man, the one who had screamed into the void, he was gone, vanished, like the others before him. Just another lost soul in the snow. But the figure would wait, always watching, always waiting for the next lonely traveler to wander too far into the winter night. And when they did, it would take them to